A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. Presentation by Shannon Lassiter and Keith Worthington. To start, we'll ask you to consider a few questions. So, was this enjoyable to read? Was it easy to follow? Was it depressing? Was it morbid? Was it funny? Was the author's message clear? On first reading, we found it was somewhat challenging. It was very morbid, even gruesome, very unsettling, and so uncomfortable to read. On second reading, we found it much easier to follow. As we'll explain later, the foreshadowing is very comprehensive. We also found it very funny. And the author's message was still left somewhat ambiguous. In order to understand this work, it's important to understand that it's a work of postmodernism. The Oxford Dictionary definition of postmodernism is a late 20th century style and concept in the arts, architecture, and criticism that represents a departure from modernism and has as its heart a general distrust of grand theories and ideologies, as well as a problematic relationship with any notion of art. 4 things to highlight. It's a complete rejection of modernism. Modernism is a ordered, methodical, scientific approach to finding a truth. Second, it involves a deliberate destruction of traditional norms, methods, and values. Third, it holds that there's no real truth, that facts are unimportant, and any invented truth is equally valid as any other. Third, it's very cerebral, creative, exhibitionist, and the answers are left open or unresolved. To help, I'll try to help clarify what postmodern is in the coming slides so you can see it in various forms. What does postmodernism look like in art? This is the painting from our text by Jackson Pollock, Autumn Rhythm number 30. It was done by basically slinging paint at a canvas. I'm going to read a quote from the author. I continue to get further away from the usual painter's tools such as easel, palette, brushes, etc. I prefer sticks, trowels, knives, and dripping fluid paint on a heavy impasto with sand, broken glass, or other foreign matter added. When I am in my painting, I am not aware of what I am doing. It is only after a sort of get-acquainted period that I see what I have been about. I have no fear of making changes, destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, I'm very representational some of the time and a little all of the time, but when you're working out of your unconsciousness, figures are bound to emerge. Painting is a state of being. Painting is self-discovery. Every good artist paints what he is. In architecture, postmodernism looks something like this. M2 Tokyo by Kingo Kuma. What you see is just a jumble of architectural motifs and ideals. So a lot of strong architectural shapes, triangles, arches. Over here, a lot of ultramodern glasswork, and in the middle, a classic Greco-Roman column. Originally, this was a Mazda showroom, but it almost seems fitting today that it's now a funeral parlor. In furniture and decoration, we get something that looks like this. You have kind of a classic Roman figurehead here, a 19th century, maybe 18th century chandelier. This would be from the 80s, so it's like ultra-modern furniture all kind of jumbled together. And in fashion, we get something like this. This is an actual maternity dress that was worn by Grace Jones to a baby shower held at a nightclub at 4 a.m. in New York City and designed by the father of her child, John Paul Gluck. And lastly, postmodernism in politics. Postmodernism only in that he's really a political outsider. He's not the traditional political figure. So postmodernism in a good man is hard to find. Okay, first of all, the story, it's not systematic, scientific, and it does not lead to a clear universal truth. Okay, the methods are new, and in contrast to expectation, there's a shock value, there's no Hollywood ending. The characters are stereotypical and contrived, and by that I mean they're created. It's not a study in character development. She specifically makes the characters the way she wants them to be to further the means and her intentions with the story. There is a message that are revealed, but they're not really clearly stated. They're sort of subtly touched upon, almost questioned. And the work is very cerebral, creative, somewhat exhibitionist, and unresolved. I hope we'll define this more as we go through the rest of this presentation. A couple of things we want to point out about the writer. First, she was very intelligent, she was well educated, and she was well trained as a writer and a journalist. So she actually went to graduate school to study writing. Second, she was raised in the South, and she was very proud of her Southern heritage. Rather than try to explain that, I'm going to let her explain that to you by reading a short section of this story.
The name of this was The Good Man Hard Time. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the iron sports section of the journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did."
So after hearing that, perhaps you could understand why when she applied for admission into the graduate program for writers at the University of Iowa, the director was unable to understand what she was saying. The third thing I wanted to point out was she was a devout Catholic. So a common term that's bandied about to describe her work is Southern Gothic, but the term she used to describe it is Christian realist. So, and this is a quote from a graduate school journal: "Please let Christian principles permeate my writing, and please let there be enough of my writing published for Christian principles to permeate. I dread, O Lord, losing my faith." A last thing I thought was important to highlight about the author is that she was diagnosed with an inherited terminal disease at the age of 25. That was systemic lupus erythematosus. She had a 5-year life expectancy, even though she actually lived for 14 more years. I think the key point is that she never thought she had very long to live, that her time on earth was going to be very short. Not sure how this came into play, but the treatment for lupus would have involved very strong steroidal anti-inflammatories. They would tend to cause irritability and depression, and long-term and extended long-term extended use, the heavy use of those medications would probably lead to drastic mood swings and muscle weakness. Towards the end of her career, she was in such a weakened state that she could actually only write for a maximum of 1 hour per day. As we get into the story, we want to talk about some of the literary devices that O'Connor uses. One of the most prevalent would be direct foreshadowing. So direct foreshadowing would be just literally telling you what's going to come later in the story. On first reading, it probably comes across as a subliminal message, but on a second reading, it almost becomes dramatic irony, and it actually becomes quite amusing. So as you're listening to these two examples I'm going to give, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So in the very opening paragraph on page 1340, the grandmother is saying this to Bailey. So, I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. Well, in the story, that is exactly what she does. She leads them straight to the misfit. And then I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Well, of course, she didn't have the opportunity because she was killed. A second example, the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of wild violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trim with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. So, in essence, she's dressing for her own funeral. Another literary device that she uses would be indirect foreshadowing. So, if you look at the footnotes, the bottom of the reading, when they talk about the cat pity sing, they reference the Mikado. So, in that Gilbert and Sullivan opera, Pity Sing is falsely accused of committing an execution. So you can relate that to, the cat causing the accident. They drive by the blue granite of Stone Mountain. Well, blue granite is the #1 material that's used for tombstones. They pass a graveyard with 5 or 6 graves in it. So the family has 3 adults, 2 children, and a baby. So maybe the baby is half of a person, or we get half a grave. So anyway, the 5 or 6 grave sites is kind of a coincidental number, though there's probably a little coincidence involved in that. They drive by Toomsboro, Georgia. So there's kind of 2 plantations in the story. One they drive by where the grave sites were located, and then the second one is the one in the grandmother's memory, the place that she thinks she's leading them to, or falsely leading them to. So, but John Wesley asks, "Where's the first plantation?" The grandmother replies, of course, "Gone with the wind," which sort of is an allusion to the secondary plantation that just actually exists really in her mind. Some more indirect foreshadowing. The misfit arrives in a hearse-like automobile. As he's standing above them while they're down in the gulch, and he looks down to them, and the way she describes his actions, his stance, his gesturing is almost as though he's looking down into a grave, paying his honor to the deceased. And then also the misfit had worked as an undertaker in the past.